GrowCFO is where finance leaders grow together. Join thousands of like-minded professionals using GrowCFO to access the combined knowledge and experience of the finance leader community. You can join us today at growcfo.net. Hello and welcome to the GrowCFO Show. I'm your host, Kevin Appleby, and today with me I've got John Lee. John is an expert when it comes to hiring a remote or a hybrid workforce. Now, we've talked about this in previous episodes, but we've talked to CFOs who are operating a remote workforce, and we've talked about the management of those people. But there's a lot more to making this work than just the management. There's a lot of compliance to think about. So we're going to talk about that today. So John, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Great to be here on the show. Thank you for having me.
John, tell me just a little bit about your background before we get into this.
Yeah, so I've a 16-year career. I was always interested in business and the finance side of the world. I actually was really interesting. I was in college back in Dublin, in University College Dublin, doing a commerce with German degree. Part of that, you got to live in Germany, was fantastic. But during that period, I actually got exposure to a lot of different entrepreneurs, went to a lot of talks with entrepreneurs. And one thing that really struck me was time and time again, a lot of the entrepreneurs I spoke with had talked about the fact that they felt they were not able to steer their ship in some ways because they felt like driving the bus with one arm tied behind their back. And I often asked them why, and they came back again and again saying, because a lot of them didn't have the financial background. So those that didn't really talked about this as something that was holding them back a bit. And I think that's one of the reasons why I then went on to do a master's in accounting, then went into the Big Four, into Deloitte to become a chartered accountant. And then from that period, then went from the Big Four into a company called CRH, Ireland's biggest company, one of the biggest building materials companies in the world, and did various different roles, internal audit, into financial control in the business, then business control, ended up being one of the senior finance leaders of a $4 billion division there. And after that, then I really enjoyed that particular period, very operational, very hands-on, visited over 150 locations across Europe over a 10-year period. And then went into the startup world. So I did 2 startups. This is my second one to work from anywhere. It's been fascinating just seeing that journey of, I suppose, somebody from who was that finance background going into the technology, the SaaS business. And I've learned a lot of lessons along the way, but I've really enjoyed it. And of course, doing it all then, having a family in the middle of it all with my wife, Dee, who's also an accountant, and then 3 kids as well. So it's been busy.
You're an accountant, big background in the Big Four and in the startup world, but clearly I sense in there a sense of wanting to work wherever you want to.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, my eldest daughter, Rosa, she's 7 now, and she's already been to 25 different countries around the world. Rosa's lived in the Netherlands. She's lived in Phuket. We spent 6 months there. She then went on to live in Ireland and now in Portugal. And so for her alone, but also for us, the family, it's been so enriching getting exposure to these different cultures. And for me, that was very deep inside within me from a very young age. And thankfully with Dee as well, she's exactly the same wavelength as well. So for us, we live for a bit of adventure, and it goes through all the family DNA.
Now, I'm looking at our own business, GrowCFO. I mean, we've got people working for us in various parts of the globe, but they're all sort of relationships there, the B2B type relationships. We don't have any employees overseas. Now, this is where the difficulty will start with this kind of model, when you actually employ somebody.
Completely. And it does get tricky because we often go to our local, especially if you're a small company, we go to our local accountants and tax advisors. They know their home market pretty well, but as soon as you go into different jurisdictions, it can become quite tricky. And even within countries as well, you look at the case of the US, there's 52,000 tax jurisdictions within the US alone. So it can be a tremendous amount of granular complexity to deal with. So it can feel overwhelming initially.
So the whole idea of this current startup, John, is to get over that obstacle.
Yeah, exactly. And so if you look at international remote work, there's 2 major components to it. Right now, we see a lot of companies that are struggling with workations and how to approve them or not. So a lot of employees are saying, I want to go work remotely in Spain for a few weeks. Well, can you allow that? What are the risks and how do you deal with them? But then separately, also, that's what we call work from anywhere. But then the other side of the coin is what you call more structural hire from anywhere. So we're also seeing a lot of companies now that are looking to hire anywhere around the world. Well, then what do you do? Do you need to open a legal entity? Can you use an employer of record? Is that model even legal in that country? What about independent contractor? Is that something that might be a good option? So there's all these different options to bear in mind and to think about. And so that's what we've done in the platform. We've basically built a platform that, in less than 20, 30 seconds, You put in your scenario and it will give you the answer. Can I approve this vacation or can I hire this person? And if so, what's the model?
Okay, so let's just explore that a little bit, and let's take that first work from anywhere bit.
Yes.
So I'm a CFO. My number two is already working reasonably remotely within, say, the UK. We're a UK company. And number two comes along and says, hey, Kevin, I'd love to go and work in Spain. I'm going to go there for 6 months. Can I do this? Don't say it's going to affect the way I do the job. What are the implications of something like that?
Great question. What you find in scenarios like this is that, previously pre-COVID, when we had very short-term business travel, people going somewhere for a few days, the risks were not very elevated in a lot of cases. And if you did have somebody who wanted to really permanently move to another country, like an expat, they tend to be a very small number of people. But the challenge is now is you've got, according to a Mercer survey released in the last few weeks, 78% of companies that are allowing workations either on a structural basis or on an ad hoc basis because they're just getting so many requests for this. But of course, if you look at the risks around that, there are plenty, and there's no two ways about it. One of the things we don't see is people sharing photos, Instagram photos of working from anywhere on a beach in North Korea, for example. There's limits. People recognize you can't truly work wherever you want. And going back to the reasons why, you look at the risks. First of all, you need to make sure you've got a visa, for example. You need to also make sure, for example, on the tax risks, of which there are many. If you look at, for example, payroll tax, there's obviously the 183 days people often talk about for the individual tax residency. But the challenge is, even on that alone, it varies from country to country. Some countries have kind of center of vital interest triggers that reduce the number of days that you can fall into that particular trap. But even beyond that, for individuals, you can also have not only individual payroll, let's say individual tax residency triggers, but you've got wage registration triggers for the employer, for example, that can kick in very often from potentially even day one. But within that broader, let's say, tax framework, you've also got corporation tax. So the concept of permanent establishment, you could have somebody, for example, that is conducting value-added activities such as sales generating activities. Maybe they're a senior director, for example, just to name about two examples. But in two cases like that, if that person decides to work in Spain for a couple of months, for example, well, then you're going to be at a higher risk of the Spanish tax authority saying, well, hold on a second, they're making key management decisions. They're actively selling your product from our territory. Therefore, we deserve some of the corporation tax take from that. So you can imagine that becomes a very high cost potentially if you get that wrong. And in fact, that's actually one of the biggest risks that we see in surveys again and again. And beyond that, then you've also got social security risks, for example. In some countries, that might be 0%. In other countries, that might be nearly half the salary. So it can be hugely different how different countries look at this, for example, as well as the strictness. And more broadly, then beyond that, you've also got the likes of employment law risks, things like, for example, contractor misclassification. If you're looking to hire somebody in a different country, employer of record compatibility is another one, for example, if you're using that model. And lastly, then you've also got other risks such as duty of care, insurance, and more, for example. So there's a kind of a short sample of some of the high-level risks you need to be conscious of. And again, it's what we see again and again. Companies try to narrow the menu of countries they allow as a result, because you can't simply allow people to work from anywhere. And that's where the technology becomes very important, to be able to automatically assess these risks.
Gosh, that's raising far more risks than I really thought we would. And I've got limited experience of this. I remember when I was working for PwC, I was sent off to do a project for a Swiss pharmaceutical company. So we were working in Basel for several weeks, and remember having to sort out certain tax arrangements with, well, fortunately, PwC dealt with it all because they were big enough to know what they were doing. But certainly there was always recognised a risk that you could be charged Swiss income tax as well as UK income tax. So I was thinking down that particular line, but then you're mentioning corporation tax, which I never thought would be a problem in those arrangements.
It's the biggest one. So we did a white paper. We surveyed over 120 companies around the world employing 1.7 million people. And permanent establishment was by far the biggest risk. Shortly, a bit behind, followed by visa and immigration. But permanent establishment was the big one. So corporation tax teams around the world are literally tearing their hair out about this at the moment, trying to find out where are the boundaries, where can we go. And part of the challenge is the degree of uniformity is not there at all yet, even on a European Union level, for example. There's no, taxes is something that's very, very sensitive. And we often say work is not a place, but unfortunately taxes are, and it remains the case. I think countries are still very sensitive about their sovereign borders, and particularly raising income from that via taxes is a critical component, obviously. So I think there's a long way to go before you'd see massive harmonization around this just yet.
So we've talked that particular case, John, that your existing employee who is on the payroll in your home country decides they want to go work somewhere else for a while.
Yes.
Then there's the whole hire overseas. And that's got to be an attractive market for a lot of companies these days where you can find highly skilled people, perhaps at a slightly cheaper wage rate. Therefore, there are two reasons to look at that overseas market.
Completely, especially if we're going to be going into a recession, or for the next recession, you'll certainly see a lot more CFOs work closely, with their HR directors and head of people and many others, try and look at how they can rethink their business model, their operating model, their workforce models. And if you take a look at a 50,000 feet, for the last couple of 100 years, companies, when expanding internationally, would always default to the legal entity route and set up what you call big bang operations, which can be quite expensive in many countries. And what you find is, what we're starting to see now is companies are being a bit more differentiated in how they're approaching this. And what they're doing is, for countries where there are a high degree of risks or very senior, very important strategic roles, for example, they're creating what they call core talent hubs, but they're starting to look more and more at supplementing this with more agile models. So when I say more agile models, I mean looking at employers of record have pros and cons, but they're a great tool in the toolbox if you're looking to potentially explore certain jurisdictions, or if you're looking to have a small number of hires in certain jurisdictions, for example, that it doesn't make sense to set up a legal entity. And to give you one example, take a look at Indonesia. In Indonesia, it costs over $700,000 to actually set up a legal entity because of the high minimal capital requirement. So the barrier is very high to looking at setting up operations there. But it's not only employers of record. In addition to legal entities and employers of record, you've also got the likes of independent contractors. And some countries are very strict on contractor misclassification, some are less so. But certainly the contractor model has a future to play in that. Again, I come back to a Mercer survey. They reckon that over the next 5 to 10 years, about 30% of the skills will be sourced in future, not from strict, let's say, rigid roles, permanent roles. It'll be coming from more agile roles sourced by independent contractors, which makes sense, because if I'm a CFO and I've got an M&A project where I need an analyst for 12 weeks, maybe I can get a really good analyst, maybe it could be in Poland or Ireland or wherever, for a limited project that could do exactly what I need. In that scenario, I do not want to be hiring that person permanently. It's much better to be able to plug and play model via independent contractor or whatnot. So I think that's a shift, that's a mindset shift that we're going to see continue over the next and accelerate over the next couple of years.
Certainly one of the things we've seen in the years we've been operating GrowCFO is the rise of the fractional CFO. And indeed, we're using in our business a fractional CMO. So those sort of models are very much on the increase. And I suppose you get around the IR35 type regulation because those people are working for multiple businesses doing a fractional role. I think that's going to be something we're going to see more and more of going forward.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's really moving beyond what you would call commodity staffing, from outsourcing low value elements that you would have seen maybe in the 90s to actually now, as you say, moving up the value chain, where you can get fractional CMOs, CFOs and whatnot. And for a lot of those people, it's the exact perfect model for them. They're in control of their hours. They decide when and how they can scale up or down their work. Maybe, during the winter, they can go full throttle, and then maybe in the summer, come back a little bit, and it allows them the flexibility to be able to work wherever they want, for example. And so I think that's very, very attractive, particularly for the younger generations. There's a high degree of attraction to that,
So, John, coming back to the business that you've set up, it's a software platform. You essentially ask it the question of, I want to hire, or I want somebody working in this location, and it tells you effectively the rules and regulations that you need to deal with. Does it go beyond that in any way?
Yeah, what we've got is it's not just about a lot of compliance tools. They just tell you about the risks, but they don't tell you, what do I do next?
Yeah.
And what you find is we're very, very proud of our platform. What we'll do is we'll tell you, I want to hire these people, for example, in India. We'll tell you the payroll tax risks, the social security risks, the permanent establishment risks, employment law, contractor misclassification, and more. But we'll also then tell you, okay, here's what you need to do next. And we'll tell you what the right solution is. Is it an employer of record? Is it a legal entity? Is it an independent contractor, for example? so that you have the full view of what are the available solutions and what their cost is. I think one of the things we've seen in this market in the last couple of years is employers of record have done a fantastic job at branding themselves as the be-all and end-all solution to every single scenario for international hiring. But I think people who have extensive experience of using employers of record know that you have to be careful to know when and when not to use them. And again, take one example, places like, for example, Spain, the model is not very compatible with Spanish labor laws, for example. There's other countries as well that might have time limitations around the model, around the use of them. And then part of the challenge is when you use an employer of record, if you use it the wrong way in the wrong country, you're going to start running into offboarding issues and everything as well. So it might be easy to get on, but then how do you offboard them? But at the same time, if you use the right kind of model in the right place, it can be very powerful. And likewise, you need to know certain countries when a legal entity is a terrible option to consider. It can be very costly, very time consuming, for example. So I think being aware of these risks, but also what the right operating model is vital. But I think the message I would encourage every CFO is take a look, explore these models, see what works for you and your organization. If you have a very tight culture, maybe you might be happy with the existing model where it's a legal entity only. But on other companies, especially fast growing ones, will be certainly looking at the employer of record model and the contractor model as being very interesting in certain scenarios.
Yeah, but one thing that strikes me there, John, you must have a platform with a lot of information in that could potentially change. How on earth do you keep this up to date?
Well, it's a great question. So that's one of the advantages of how we built our platform is we've taken an algorithmic approach to it. So for example, permanent establishment, one of the biggest risks. We basically have hundreds of data points that are coming into it in what we call a resting state database, where we've gone in and we've codified the tax legislation, the definition of permanent establishment, is it low, medium, or wide? We've taken a bunch of other sources from OECD, World Bank, and many others. And then we've created dynamic inputs from the user input that dynamically shift up or down the risk, but we also then take into account the company's risk appetite, because that's absolutely crucial. Some companies have a low risk appetite, like banks, for example, that are heavily regulated, whereas others, for example, especially in the technology sector, they might actually have a higher risk appetite. So for them, they're happy to accept a little bit more risk. So that's the beauty. We have the three planks of the resting state risk. We have the multipliers that adjust up or down depending on the input of the user. And we have the company's risk appetite. And then that's what basically feeds into the weighted average risk. And yes, we do have basically all email alerts and everything set up, and we monitor legislation. What you find is certain parts of the algorithm are much more susceptible to changes in legislation, for example, and have much bigger impact. Take, for example, digital nomad visas. There's a new one of those nearly every month, for example, and previously, 3 years ago, there was none. And so we're finding some parts of it very susceptible to frequent change, whereas others tend to be a little bit more stable over time.
So if I was a CFO thinking about either hiring overseas, or I know that I've got staff that want to work overseas, I come along and I have a look at your platform. Well, I can see a one-off reason to use it.
Sure.
So how does the purchasing of that platform work?
Yeah, so what you'll find is that the price of the platform, it varies between $2,000 and $30,000, depending on the size of your platform and depending on what you're looking for. So companies that are looking to assess business expansion for hiring from anywhere, where to hire and how to hire, typically that's not a one-off request. They'll typically have multiple requests of assessing the different contractors in different countries they want to hire, or employers of record or legal entities, for example. So they might have a request now, but they'll probably be highly likely to have another request in a few weeks' time, or certainly a few months' time. The one we see that certainly is more structural is the workation requests. So we're finding, again, vast majority of companies are getting a lot of workation requests. And then, well, what do? You just say yes, or do you go and as a team invest the time in doing all the research? What happens when you're getting the signs that it could be higher risk? Do you go to an external tax advisor? How do you know what to do with the next steps? So with our platform, it will show the risks and workations and tell you the compliance checklist, what you need to do, for example. And we've got third-party advisors we can introduce you to if you need it as well to go further. So that's very much how the platform works.
It's very much designed for ongoing use by the business.
Right. And that's what's important, because that's how you can generate the savings from either time, saving in the research, or savings from going to external advisors, for example. But I think also broadly, I think as CFOs, it's very easy for us to look at just, the immediate direct transactional savings. But you can also find, obviously, by being able to put in place a policy, you'll get better retention, for example. You'll get easier to, say, attract higher talent, higher quality of talent, for example. For example, take a look at Spotify. A year after they announced their work from anywhere policy, they had a significant reduction in attrition. They had an increase in diversity and inclusion, for example. And you can see much broadly, when you look at a lot of the companies that are doing this, they're able to get a much greater talent pool. I think that's the biggest piece. But obviously, from a CFO perspective, a lot of it will come down to the fact, look, a developer costs you, $500,000 or more in Silicon Valley. You can get the same quality developer without impacting the customer experience for an absolute fraction of that, for example, in Pakistan or India, for example.
Yeah, providing you're prepared to take any hit that you might on the language barrier.
Correct. Yeah. Intercultural piece is very important for sure. Absolutely. My previous startup was an intercultural startup. So it's something that I appreciate more than others. Yeah.
So tell me, across the sort of clients that are using your platform, and John, what are the most common types of roles and locations that you find cropping up?
So we do find Europe comes up quite a bit. There's a lot of requests in Europe simply because one of the reasons is the ability to, let's say, work from anywhere within Europe is that a little bit easier, I would say. And a lot of our clients are, let's say, European based. In terms of, let's say, the North American market, you do find a fair bit of movement from the likes of US to Mexico, for example, is something that's popping up. But we're also starting to see, if you look at regionally around the world, I would say Europe has been further ahead from what we've seen, but there has been a lot of activity in the US market, people looking to work remotely in Mexico. But we're starting now to see the likes of Asia as well. There's certainly much more of an interest, and I was on a webinar with over 300 companies there a few weeks ago in Asia. And yeah, there's definitely more of an interest there. Probably Australia leading it in Asia, Australia, New Zealand, but places like Singapore now, China and Japan starting to pay closer attention to it. From my perspective, I haven't seen as much in the likes of Africa. The legislation is a little bit trickier. It's less open to the concept of work from anywhere. And certainly Latin America, you're starting to see more interest there now as well. So probably at a high level, Europe is where there's a lot more activity that certainly we're seeing from our perspective.
What sort of roles then?
The roles, well, if you talk about let's say within companies, the roles that are trying to deal with these challenges of how to navigate work from anywhere, it's very much cross-functional in that it's global mobility, the finance teams, tax teams, and legal teams, immigration teams, if they have any, are very much trying to coordinate all of this, and recruitment and HR, very much trying to coordinate all this internally. But in terms of the roles, well, you typically find definitely people between the ages of 18 and 40, the concept of work from anywhere is very, very popular. The roles then, it really varies. We find, for example, people certainly in finance roles have a big attraction to it. People in marketing roles as well. Part of the challenge is that people in lower seniority roles, I would say it's easier to get approval for work from anywhere. Whereas people in higher seniority roles, it's a little bit trickier. We do find people in technology roles that's very popular with as well. It's certainly a big part of that, I would say. Salespeople in sales roles, they want to be able to work from anywhere, but part of the challenge is permanent establishment does make it a little bit trickier because very often they're sales generating. So in general, I would say it's pretty consistent across the board, the people that want to work from anywhere, but I would say at the same time, it's a little bit trickier of who can be allowed. And obviously you need to make sure they've got the visa and whatnot as well, amongst others.
Okay. So we're hearing a lot at the moment, John, about AI and its infiltration into all sorts of platforms. How do you see AI impacting your world?
AI is very important to follow. I've been familiar with it for a number of years myself. I did a course a couple of years ago back in Amsterdam around the concept of AI. And for me, the way I look at it personally is you've got to be constantly searching for what's on the edge of innovation for new ideas. I have to say, generative AI does excite me, but I think when it comes to tax and legal aspects, what's vital for us and what we pride ourselves on is that we don't have what you would call a black box. We have full control over everything that goes into our algorithm. And we make sure that everything is vetted and verified, and it's done by human touch, because we need to have full control. We cannot have the risk of putting something like generative AI in. And I've seen consistently when playing around and testing out generative AI, different generative AI tools, how it will confidently give you the wrong answer.
Oh, yeah. If it doesn't know the right answer, it'll make one up. Or if you haven't.
Well, yeah, exactly. So it's a little bit like, I suppose, Google search. It's understanding how to use it and how not to use it. But in our line of work, I've seen many examples where I put a question in just out of curiosity into generative AI. It would give me the wrong answer and confidently go down the rabbit hole of keeping to give me the wrong answer. And the only place you can go is go back to the raw legislation in the vast majority of cases, which unfortunately is more painstaking, it's more tedious, but for us, that's the power, at least with what we're doing. At least we know for us, we need to see it with our own eyes, for example, to be able to to be able to plug it into the platform. But I do feel it's exciting. I do feel there's leaps forward that it's going to be doing over the next couple of years. And absolutely, with what we're doing, if you told me in 5 or 10 years it'd completely replace what we're doing, I wouldn't be surprised. So for me, all we can do is focus on the here and right now and take pride in what we've built to keep staying on the edge of what we're doing and what customers are looking for. And so far, so good.
Absolutely. So 2024, what's next for you?
Well, for us, I think the aim would be to continue to onboard Fortune 500 companies, small companies, medium-sized companies, large and small alike. We've been delighted about the last year. It's been a very busy year for us, particularly towards the back end of it. And we're very excited about what's coming ahead. And I think for me, I would say when we were speaking about these topics back in 2021, a lot of people laughed us out of the room and said, there's not going to be any workation market. We don't see that being a factor. And we don't see it being as an employee benefit. And we kept on trying to make the case to a lot of companies. And it's great to see, again, go back to that Mercer survey. I think it's over 70% of companies now are already, offering this as benefit. So what I get excited about is looking at where work from anywhere is going already, but also for hire from anywhere, how the market needs people like ourselves doing what we're doing to help companies understand, almost like being a referee, to help them understand how to use the different models, be it a digital visa, an employer of record, or contract, or a legal entity. Because I think there's a lot of different providers out there that will try and push you down one route or another. But that's where if you have technology that can be neutral to help CFOs understand what is the right model I need to use that will keep us safe, and will keep me from being awake at night, and also manage everything from a cost and compliance perspective. I think if we can do that, I'd be very happy. So for me, I'm very excited about that evolution of work from anywhere and hire from anywhere and where that's going to be over the course of this year.
Yeah, I think it's a space to watch. And certainly 2 years ago, 3 years ago on this podcast, we were hardly talking about remote working at all or hybrid working. It's very much a thing that a lot of companies are embracing. So be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. John, that was fantastic. Thank you very much for being this week's guest on the GrowCFO Show.
It was a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.